Glad to have you with us again as we continue to study the book of Matthew. Thank you for joining us. And if you are joining us for the first time, I would suggest you go back and look at some of our other videos as we're picking up in Matthew chapter 4 rather. We've already talked about the first three chapters and most of chapter 4. And so those are available on our YouTube page, and we encourage you to go back and listen to those. We have with us today David Holmes and Carrie Boyd, as well as Luke, who's been joining us in each of these lessons. As I said, we're going to pick up in the latter portion of chapter 4. We are using some questions to go along as we're studying through the text. And I'm going to put those in the description. And I'm going to try to go backfill those in the descriptions of the previous videos. And so if you'd like those, you can drop down the description and download those questions as you go along so that you can follow along with us. So far in Matthew chapter 1, we're introduced to Jesus' origins. His origins from his genealogy, and then also his origins from his birth, the virgin birth, and so forth. Then coming into chapter 2, we look at the way Jesus is worshipped by the Magi, the way he is dismissed by his own people, and the way that he is pursued violently by Herod. Coming into chapter 3, we've looked at the work of John the Baptist and the baptism that John performed on Jesus. And that really introduces us then to Jesus' ministry beginning in chapter 4. It begins with Jesus being led into the wilderness to be tempted. We looked at those temptations, very direct confrontation Jesus has with Satan there in Matthew chapter 4. And so now we're coming then to the end of chapter 4 and the call of the disciples as well as the beginning of Jesus' ministry there in Galilee. So, looking there at the picking up in verse 18, we see Jesus come to the Sea of Galilee, and he sees two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, and they're casting their net into the sea because they're fishermen. And Jesus says to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And so as we look at that particular question there, that particular statement there, Carrie, what is the nature of the response of these first disciples being called here?
So when Jesus tells them to follow me, I'll make you fishers of men, a little bit of the additional details of the story we have from Luke's account. Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they had been fishing all night and hadn't caught anything. Jesus come across them, go back out into the deep, let down their nets. They did. They caught so much fish that they started breaking their nets. Even when James and John came over, filled both boats and started to sink. From Matthew's account, when they responded to Jesus' statement, "Follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men," their response was immediate. They left their nets, they left their boat. James and John even left their father Zebedee, and I think even from Mark's account, they even left their hired servants. So they had left, they had basically leaving behind their livelihood, leaving their family in case of Zebedee's father, as well as life as they knew it.
Yeah, and so what we see is that their response is not only immediate, as Matthew points out, but as Carrie mentioned, bringing in the other accounts, we see that it's immediate right in the face of considerable professional success, maybe one of the most successful days they've ever had. And then they walk away from that and follow Jesus to become fishers of men. And so we see a real commitment right from the start there. We might even add John's account, which suggests that they've had previous interactions with Jesus. This is not just some random stranger coming up, but this is a man who they know has the authority to command their allegiance, both because of their previous interaction as well as because of what we learned from the other accounts on this occasion. Well, they come and they do follow him, and as you suggested, James and John as well come and follow him. And we're told that then he goes throughout all Galilee, beginning in verse 23, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness among the people. And the news about him was spread throughout Syria, and they brought to him all who were ill, those suffering with various diseases and pains, and he goes on and makes a list. Now, what do you notice about miracles being performed here, David?
Well, number one, I'd say there's a lot of them.
Absolutely.
A word that stands out to me in verse 23 and 24, at least in the New King James Version, is all. I mean, you have all Galilee, all kinds of disease, all kinds of sickness, all Syria, all sick people. If you're reading the New American Standard, you might have the word every there, every kind of disease, every kind of sickness. I believe sometimes we underestimate the sheer number of miracles that Jesus actually performed when he was here on earth. And right here at the beginning of his ministry, we see that he healed all kinds of sickness, all kinds of disease, torments, demon-possessed, epileptics, and paralytics. He healed all of them. We can go through the Gospels and we can see the individual cases highlighted where he healed the demon-possessed, the paralytic, the blind man, the leper, etc. But how many multitudes more did he heal in these two verses alone? This reminds me of what John said in the very last verse of his gospel in John chapter 21 and verse 25. It says, "And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." So on top of that, like you said, the diversity of miracles that Jesus performed is amazing. Here we read about the various types of healing he performed, but if you go throughout the Gospels, what about his power over nature, changing water to wine, the calming of the winds, walking on water, etc.? When we consider all the miracles that Jesus did, I believe it really points to the deity of our Lord and Savior, and it had the effect that was intended. In verse 25, great multitudes followed him.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, the miracles are, the purpose of the miracles is evidence. As far as the sheer number, we see John at the end of his gospel saying, I haven't even gotten to everything. What I have included is sufficient. It's enough. But there's so much more, just as you mentioned there. And the breadth of Jesus' control. And we'll go on to see these miracles as they're listed out more specifically, the completeness of these miracles. None of these miracles are performed by half measures. When Jesus heals, he heals completely. He heals totally. When he casts out demons, he casts them out totally. And so we see the depth and the breadth of Jesus' power, which, as you say, brings large crowds. It brings people to come to understand the nature of the man that they're dealing with. Well, we are just barely introduced to that ministry before we open up in chapter 5 with one of the most well-known sermons that Jesus gives. Now, as far as the time that we might spend, we could, there's enough material in Matthew chapters 5 through 7 for us to spend 3 whole months just on those 3 chapters. We're trying to get all of the book of Matthew in 3 months, and so we're going to summarize and quickly look at a lot of the instruction here. But I'd encourage everybody to spend more time. In fact, I think a lot of times we do that. We really hone in and spend a great deal of time on each aspect of this sermon, more than we kind of get the general sense of what Jesus is saying. And so I think there's real value in moving through this sermon at some kind of a pace. Certainly, Jesus moved through it at that kind of pace. And so we can take in and we can appreciate the whole message as we're going through. Now, we are going to break it up somewhat, and we're going to just look at the first of those 3 chapters in that sermon today. The first part of that sermon is generally referred to as the Beatitudes. It says it's called the Sermon on the Mount because the very first verse says when he saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain. Now, some people have made connections between Jesus going up on the mountain here and Moses going up on the mountain back in Exodus chapters 19 and 20. And I think that they're not wrong in making that allusion there, that here is Jesus delivering the law of the kingdom, whereas Moses was delivering the law to the chosen people of the Old Testament. Well, his disciples come, and it says he opened his mouth and he began to teach them, began to preach to them. And as we look at that list of Beatitudes, it's interesting as you go down through. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Now, many of these, you've got a compare and contrast. You've got, a negative aspect, and then here's the positive aspect. But they end this way with 10 and 11, verses 10 and 11. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kind of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, you can easily get a sense of disconnect as you're moving through these first Beatitudes, and then why on earth would you be persecuted? So what do you think is the connection between these the first few Beatitudes and then these final three verses of that section, Luke?
So there is, as you said, obviously a bit of a difference in the two sections, but I think the relation is the kingdom aspect. In fact, the first thing that Jesus says in that first beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The first thing that he mentions, in a sense, is the kingdom. And so this first section is talking verses 3 through 9, where it says, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, for they shall receive. This first section is talking about how people who are a part of the kingdom are to act. And then in verses 10 and 11, where it kind of switches to blessed are you when you're persecuted, that second section is talking about how people who are a part of the kingdom will be treated, how people will act towards them. And so I think the relation is the kingdom. And ultimately, when those who are a part of the kingdom, when you are acting like what he talks about in verses 3 through 9, when you're acting like Christ, when you're imitating him, that will lead to what he talked about in verses 10 through 11, to persecution. And it's perfectly exemplified in his own life. But also when you go to Acts and you see the apostles, and we know that from our own experiences, when we are trying to imitate Christ, that persecution does follow because of that, because we're trying to imitate him in that way.
Yeah. And I think it's extraordinary as you look at the qualities of poverty of spirit and mourning and gentleness, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, mercy, pureness of heart, peacemakers. You would think that these are not qualities that would engender strife. And yet, Jesus shows us that they do. They do engender strife, that this is the very sort of person who will be hated in this world, because we really do not end up going along with the path that most of the rest of the world is going to be going. And so, you might think, well, here's a person who's just minding their own business. They're kind and they're generous and merciful. How could they possibly be hated? Well, look around. I mean, you must join in to one path or another, and most of those paths hate people who aren't a part of that fray, who stay out of it, and who have a focus that is past this world, beyond this world. Well, looking at some of those contrasts, the idea of poor in spirit, but then particularly mourning and comforted. The meek or gentle, as it says in Matthew chapter 4, and then inheriting the earth, the hungering and thirsting and being satisfied. Particularly in mourning and hungering and thirsting, there is this idea that you will get the thing that you need. If you're mourning, you'll be comforted. If you're hungry and thirsting, you'll be satisfied. But I think there's some more to think about that, because what if we become so satisfied that we stop hungering and thirsting? Carrie, what do you think about that?
So, we live in a world of evil, godlessness at times, disease, death, persecution, in addition to our physical needs for food, for substance. But we shouldn't take comfort in, as you stated, as what the world takes comfort in. Verse 12 there, as you read a minute ago, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So our reward isn't here, and our reward is elsewhere. That reminds me of Revelations 21, verses 3 and 4. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. So we see there that in heaven is our reward, from the mourning, from the suffering, from the persecution that we have in this age. Over in Luke's account, it also gives us a warning in Luke 6:25. Woe to you who are full, for you shall hunger. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall weep and mourn. Those are the people that are living that worldly life now and that are not suffering for the cause of Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you think about that mourning and the hungering and thirsting, it draws you to God, and you get comfort. But that doesn't. But so long as we're here, there will be calls for mourning. Just as the very things that you mentioned, our lasting comfort and eternal comfort comes after this life. I'll just say one more thing about that. That as we hunger and thirst for righteousness, we pursue it, we want that. And it says you'll be satisfied. You'll find what you're looking for. And yet, it's not the kind of satisfaction, again, while we're here, that makes it so that we don't want that anymore. We still pursue it. It's like developing a taste for it. And the more you develop a taste for it, the more you want it. But the more you want it, the more you'll get. And so it's a cycle here. And I think that with many of these Beatitudes, that when you begin to pursue this, you receive it, and then that makes you want more of that, and it feeds on itself. And so in some sense, we should continue to mourn appropriately and continue to find comfort, and we should continue to hunger and thirst and continue to find satisfaction and so forth. Well, he transitions from these Beatitudes into the example of the citizen of the kingdom. He talks about being salt and being light, and those ideas of influence to those who are round about us. David, what do you think about what Jesus says there?
First, I think it's interesting how he makes this transition. As you said, he goes from verses 3 through 12, speaking to the characteristics that citizens of the kingdom should possess, and just how blessed it is to be persecuted for Christ's sake. But then in verses 13 through 16, as you said, he speaks to the influence that these previously described type of citizen should have on the rest of the world. Verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. That's talking to Christians. Christians are the salt of the earth. It's our influence, it's our example, our light that should give glory to the Father and lead others to Christ. And if we lose our flavor, or we hide our light, then what value or what worth do we really have to the Father? I believe that Jesus is making somewhat of a contrast here. Christians are either of the world or they are of the kingdom. We are either of the darkness or of the light. And Jesus is stating here that citizens of his kingdom are that light. So it doesn't make sense if you try to hide a light I believe this is one of those passages that teach us that a Christian's not supposed to live like a hermit, completely away from everyone else in the world. Well, that's like trying to hide a light under a basket. It don't make sense. Instead, as Jesus states in verse 16, our light should be shining before men, and that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. In 1 John chapter 1 and verse 5, it says that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. I believe that's the benchmark for us. Although we are sinful man and 100% is not attainable, I believe that's what Jesus wants us to strive for. A light that shines so bright that it leads many others to Christ, and which of course gives glory to the Father as well.
Yeah, and I think that idea of reflecting, we will not be, it's a refraction, we might say. We're not going to be a picture perfect reflection. What we're trying to do is live lives that where we're so focused on Him that people see where our focus is. They look at us and our lives point in that direction. Absolutely. Well, after he says this, he picks up in verse 17 saying, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." And so Jesus seems to be answering an objection that was already in place, or perhaps growing, that his teaching was in a negative way towards the law, that he was teaching a replacement, perhaps, of the law. But he says, "I didn't come to do away with or abolish the law, rather came to fulfill it." Luke, what do you think that means? I came to fulfill the law.
Well, first of all, I think an important point to make is he's the only one to have ever kept the law perfectly. Jesus really did. When he says, "I didn't come to abolish the law," it's clear that he didn't, because in his life he follows it. He lives by the law that is taught by God from the Old Testament up till now. And when he talks about the law and the prophets, this kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that he kept the law perfectly. The law and the prophets pointed to Jesus in a lot of different ways, particularly with the prophets. Every prophecy you see, it's pointing to Jesus. And, when you look at some parts of the Old Testament, you may not completely understand how. When you look at a specific verse, you may not understand how it's pointing to Jesus, but it is, because that was what he was about, to follow it perfectly and completely. And I remember someone said this one time when they were talking about the Old Testament. They said, if you were trying to make a comprehensive list of every verse in the Bible that talks about Jesus, if you left any verse from the Old Testament out, it wouldn't be a complete list. And I love that, because that's so true. Again, even though you may not understand completely how it connects to Jesus, all of it is. And that's why in verse 18, why I think he says not one stroke of the law will pass away until all is accomplished. And so he shows that in his life, that he lived it perfectly and did it perfectly to that extent. And you might have something to add there.
Yeah, I think that's two ways. In the one way, he fulfills it by showing what it looks like to live by the law. No one ever had, but he does. And I think it's a very important point, because we think of the law as something harsh, or that would be bad to live under. If everybody lived under it like they were supposed to, Jesus is what they would look like. That would be pretty great. So he fulfills it in that way. But then secondly, he fulfills it in the other way that Luke was mentioning, that the whole Old Testament is pointing to Jesus. And so whether it's the sacrifices, whether it's the men, the prophets, like Moses, whether it's the priesthood, the high priesthood, the tabernacle, there's so many ways in which the Old Testament all comes together. It's like everything converges at Jesus. And so it ought to have just clicked. Here are people, students of the law, when they see Jesus, they ought to have said, here it is. And many did, and hopefully we still do. But a great many people who knew the law well missed the connection, missed the culmination to where the law led. Well, Jesus says there that their righteousness, his disciples are listening, this must exceed or surpass the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, or they cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And so I think he goes through making some comparisons. Here's what the righteousness of the Pharisees looks like. And then here's how you exceed that righteousness. Here's how you pursue true righteousness, in other words. And he does so by pointing back to the law and giving several instances saying, you've heard it was said this. So here's the Pharisees' sort of boiled down, simple rule. But then here's how I want you to think deeper about that rule. So he begins there. We're picking up in verse 21. You have heard that it was said, or that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. And then he goes on to say, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into fiery hell. And then he goes and talks about making amends with your brother. If you know you have a problem with your brother, leave even your worship and go and reconcile. So comparing what they've heard with what Jesus has to say, Carrie, what is it that's the problem with their interpretation?
Their interpretation, they were too concerned with the very act of murder within itself, not what was in the heart of the individual that led up to the murder. The anger that was mentioned here, the hatred that was in their heart that built up to the point to take a physical act against someone. That is not, obviously, that is not something that should be harbored in anyone's heart. The total lack of love, concern that we should have for one another. In Matthew 22, verse 36, it says, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like to it. You should love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So it's taking what is the act here, avoiding that hatred that builds up in one's heart to go and to commit such a heinous act as murder, the taking of a life, versus putting the love and the caring and concern for another brother as we would for our own selves.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to see is that they were most concerned about only the provable, prosecutable act, but never the heart. And that's several of these. That seems to be the case. And in all of these cases too, when you have a real case of murder, I think a point to take from this is it didn't just start there, right? That had to start somewhere, and it's a much deeper heart issue. And in their mind, they're going basically, as long as you don't go this far. And Jesus is saying, back it way up from there. And so back it all the way to the point that when you know you have a problem, don't even let that sit there. Go get that reconciled so that it doesn't even have a chance. Murder's not possible if we take it to that degree. Well, along similar lines, he picks up with the next, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And it makes the same statement about the right hand. And so some similar thoughts, but now we're talking about lust. And so what is his instruction, and how does it differ from what they've heard, David?
Yeah, well, it is similar. I mean, instead of murder, now we're onto adultery, and making the comparison there. But we know from Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24 that God said, "A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." God meant marriage to be for life. We know the Seventh Commandment in Exodus chapter 7, verse 14, which Jesus states here, "You shall not commit adultery." This Mosaic law of adultery is defined for us in Leviticus 20, verse 10, as a violation of a marriage covenant through sexual contact. But Jesus, he takes this a step further in Matthew 5 and verse 28, what we just read, by saying, "Whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And I think this is maybe where they didn't fully appreciate this law. I don't believe Jesus is necessarily giving a new command here, but instead he's reinforcing the law concerning covetousness, which is taught in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17. So Jesus is saying that adultery is not just an external sin, but I believe it's which I believe is how they mostly viewed it. But Jesus says it can also be an internal sin of the heart. And in verse 29 and 30, he points to how serious a sin this can be and the extremes we should take if it causes us to sin. We know that the lust of the eyes can be one of the greatest struggles for many people. In 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16, it says that all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. So I don't think Jesus is teaching self-mutilation here, but he's using hyperbole to demonstrate how egregious this sin really is, and how we must be willing to make whatever sacrifice is necessary to avoid it.
Yeah, absolutely. Go to great lengths to avoid this, and so whereas I think in the case of the brother murder, it's go and reconcile, go make peace with that brother so it doesn't end up here. In this case, it's avoid, do whatever is necessary to take away the things that lead you down that path. I think in our terms, in our modern era, this involves putting boundaries, putting walls in between us and pornography, for instance. And so Job talks about, "I've made a covenant with my eyes that I will not look upon the young woman." And so we have to do that. And that may mean, in our extremes, that may mean I do away with my smartphone and go back to a flip phone. People think, I can't live without the internet. You could live without the internet easier than you can live without an eyeball. And Jesus says, do what it takes. Avoid this, because hell is the consequence of not avoiding. Well, continuing on that same line of thought, the next thing that he picks up is divorce, going along with adultery that David mentioned. So in verse 31, "Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce." It was said, he says, "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." This one is rather brief in comparison to some of the other statements of comparison that Jesus makes. And it's interesting because he goes back and he makes a quotation from the book of Deuteronomy regarding Moses' instruction to give a certificate of divorce. But I think, and the rabbinical schools had a lot of debate about this particular passage. And what they debated was what it said was if a woman finds no favor in her husband's eyes and he sends her away for any uncleanness and he gives her a certificate of divorce. One school of thought focused on the certificate of divorce and said basically it doesn't matter how she finds disfavor, so long as he gives her certificate of divorce, that cleans it up, that clarifies it, and makes it a valid divorce. Then there was another school of thought that said, no, let's focus on the uncleanness, right? He said if this is the case, and in fact, one of the rabbinical schools defined that as adultery. And that if that is the reason he's putting her away, let him give a certificate of divorce. And then there was another school that was looser than all of them, that was really akin to our modern day, that would just open the door completely wide open. And just, it could be something, not even finding disfavor with her, but he just found a better prospect and didn't want to take care of this wife anymore. And so, lots of schools of thought, but I think the idea here is targeting that notion that if you give a certificate of divorce, that condones all divorce. And I do think that Jesus goes back to what God has always intended for marriage, like he does in Matthew chapter 19, which we'll look at in another lesson, of course. And he points back there and says, look, God doesn't want divorce at all. And there's one cause that it's justified. And so the Pharisees had like so many other rules, had looked at this rule and had focused on one aspect of it and made a loophole rule out of it. We can divorce for any reason so long as we do the procedure right. Really, that's our modern world's context of divorce. There is no fault. There is no reason that needs to be given. You simply go file the right papers, have the right certificates, and there can be no reason at all for the divorce. Incompatible differences. And so I think Jesus is attacking that very sort of thing that is rampant in our culture today. No, God does not want divorce. There's one cause for divorce. You focused on the procedure rather than the importance of the marriage. Well, continuing on then, he says, you shall make no false vows, but shall fulfill all your vows to the Lord. He says, I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statements be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. And so what's the distinction between their mentality about oaths and what Jesus has to say, Luke?
So ultimately, as you just read through them, ultimately, I think that their mentality on the vows that they were making was that they had almost pretty much disconnected completely God where they shouldn't have. And in every instance that you just read, I think it refers back to something to where it really is connected to God. And I think that this is also something that Jesus will talk about in chapter 23, where he's giving the woes to the scribes and the Pharisees. And one of the woes in verse 16, he says, woe to you blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. And then he goes on to say, well, what's more important, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And then he moves on to the altar and does the same thing. What's more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? And then in verse 22, he gets to the answer, I think, which is whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. And so back in Matthew chapter 5, again, I think that is the point. You swear by one, you're swearing by the other, and you can't disconnect God from any of it. And especially from these different things, from the highest heaven to the throne of God, to even Jerusalem, which was an important city, obviously, but for that is the city of the great king. And then even to yourself, when it talks about you you cannot make one hair white or black. Even when it comes to myself, I'm still not in control. I still don't have the authority to do that. And so every vow is connected to God, is connected to the Lord. And as we just said, from heaven to ourselves. And ultimately in verse 37, where he says, so let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. Jesus is teaching those, I think, if I'm not mistaken, who are a part of his kingdom, that every vow or every answer that you give, it's important, and it's not insignificant, because ultimately it all goes back to God. You don't get to choose what's important and what's not.
Yeah. And so they categorized their vows, made some vows of importance and other vows of no importance. And Jesus says, no matter what you're saying, where you're saying it, or what you're attaching your statement to, God is there. And God is a part of it. And so you can't detach your language from God. And it's honesty. That's the key here, is to be honest and genuine in all of our speech. Well, coming then to the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, he comes back to relational aspects with other people. He says, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And here's a familiar part of this section. He says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn him the other also. Someone wants to take your shirt, let him have your coat also. And whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. There is the instruction, and then this very contrasting instruction to yield to insults. Carrie, what's the difference here in their mentality versus Jesus's?
That they were trying to make things enact punishment based upon what's been done to them, and an equal tit for tat type of thing, which that goes against what we read a few minutes ago about having love for our neighbor as ourselves, and also Romans 12 and verse 20. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him drink. For doing so, you'll heap coals of fire on his head. Do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. We're going to get into a mode of trying to figure out what's the equal retaliation. I mean, we're going to spend our entire life trying to retaliate for some stuff that, for the most part, it really doesn't matter. We talked earlier in the lesson. This is temporary where we're at now. It's just not our future home that we should be striving for. Sometimes we're going to have to be wronged in the process. We're going to have to be perhaps taken advantage of in order to, avoid the situation. That's not the spirit that the Lord wants us to have in terms of retaliating against a brother or against someone for things that we think we've been wrong about.
Yeah, and I think another thing about that is, you think about it, a lot of these things, especially the going 1 mile, we can attach that to Roman soldiers. That was a legal thing that they could ask a non-citizen to carry their baggage 1 mile. Well, if you think about the Jew living in that context, and so a Roman soldier comes and slaps you, really, what could you do? Well, Jesus says, here's something you could do. You could make a choice about how you respond to that. Instead of just being embittered and so forth and angry and wishing you could do something in return, just take the insult, receive it, and even grow from it. And I think that's one of the things that we can do, instead of thinking in terms of how do I get right back at that guy. No, how do I receive this and learn and grow even from these insults? And really what that does is put the citizen of this kingdom in a win-win situation. You think about Acts chapter 5, when the apostles were beaten in Acts chapter 5 and they're leaving the rejoicing. Imagine imagine Gamaliel and the others on the council there, and they're seeing them come out of this room or cell or whatever where they've been beaten, and they see them smiling and rejoicing, and they look over at the soldiers and say, hey, we told you to beat them. We did. We beat them. Well, then why are they rejoicing? We don't know. we can't figure it out. And it's because here are men who are thinking beyond just the personal insult. They're realizing we've been made closer to Christ this day. And then you think, on the other hand, what if they had decided because of that to not beat them? Well, that's not a lose situation either. It's not bad if you don't get beaten. So no matter what happens, you win. And so what Christ is doing is not teaching people here to surrender in a way that says, I give up. But rather, it's yield in a way that is really a position of power, the power of the kingdom. So, finally, we come down to question 10, and it goes along with some of the things that we've already said, both that Carrie talked about earlier on the command about murder, and then also this command about an eye for an eye. But I think it really comes down to this final instruction here that hits very deep. You've heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, sends his rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. David, what's the challenge here that Jesus offers?
Well, I believe your last comments really lead into this really well, because to love our enemy, it's a mindset. We can make up our mind and choose to do that. May not be easy, but it's a mindset. I believe the main problem with the interpretation here that they had is the hate your enemy part that Jesus states in verse 43. Nowhere that I'm aware in the old law does it teach one to hate their enemy. But over time, I suspect that the elders twisted this scripture, along with others, to mean something different than what God meant. I read some commentary about this that explained how over time they restricted the word neighbor to mean relatives, friends, those of their party, and at the most, those of Israel. So to love your neighbor, as they interpreted it would have been just doing what's natural for any of us. But now, not only for them, but for us as well, Jesus hits us with a ton of bricks. He says in verse 44, but I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you. I believe this is the type of character and love that Jesus is calling for the citizens of his kingdom to have. And this may seem like an impossible task to many people, but as Christians, I believe we must strive for this type of perfection, as Jesus states in verse 48. I know for me personally, the more that I've come to understand the definition of love, the more it's helped me to understand this love your enemies, because it is quite I just can't imagine the look on their face, the faces when Jesus said this. But the word love in verse 44, agapo, is the verb form of the word love that we are familiar with in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which is agape. But to my understanding, they have very similar meaning. So if we think about 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind, love is not jealous, boastful, rude, etc., then apply that to love your enemies. And I think if about someone that might be my enemy, or someone that might hate me, and I ask myself, can I be patient with them? Can I still be kind to them? Can I not be jealous or rude to them? And if so, then we can love our enemies as Christ has commanded.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting as he quotes what they've heard. You shall love your neighbor. If you go back to Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18, you have the full quote, which Jesus quotes in Matthew 22. Carrie referenced that earlier. The quote is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So when Jesus is saying what they've heard is only part of it. You shall love your neighbor. The as yourself raises the love to the love you're describing, the agape love. And so already, if it's just love your neighbor, we've lowered the expectation of how much we have to love our neighbor. So love your neighbor, not as yourself, just love him. Some will be sufficient. Then hate your enemies. Well, now I get to categorize. And if I can put anybody into the category of enemy, I don't have to love him. Well, who's their enemies? Certainly Gentiles would have been their enemies. We see as you look at rabbinical traditions, one of the things that they would have said over the years as they developed those traditions, if a Jew sees a Gentile fallen into the sea, let him by no means lift him out. For it is written, thou shalt not rise up against the blood of thy neighbor, but this man is not thy neighbor. And so they specifically categorize Gentiles as not neighbor. Of course, tax collectors would be the same, as Jesus illustrates here in this very context. You're just like the tax collector. You're just like the Gentile. In other words, the very people that they considered enemies, Jesus is saying, you're just like them if this is the way that you treat people. And so he says, no, you treat your enemies the same way you treat your neighbors. And so what happens then is now everybody's in the category of neighbor. You see, where they could make distinctions, say, gotta love neighbor, but not enemy. No, now if it's enemies, now it includes everybody. And the kind of treatment, this is, David said in the Old Testament, you referenced that there's not the command to love the enemy. It's not only that there's not that, there is quite the opposite. In Romans chapter 12, when Paul wants to show how we ought to treat our enemies, he quotes Proverbs chapter 25. But additionally, I would point to Exodus chapter 23 and verses 4 and 5. In Exodus 23 verses 4 and 5, it gives the almost identical instruction as what you ought to do when you find a neighbor's animal gone astray. Deuteronomy 22 tells you what you ought to do when you find your countryman's ox or animal, how you ought to take care of him and return him. In Exodus 23 verses 4 and 5, it says, when you find your enemy's animal, when you find the animal of one who hates you. And then he goes on to say, you do the same thing as if it's your neighbor's animal. And you are going to be held responsible for how you treat your enemy in that instance. And so it's just what Jesus says here. You treat them all the same. And if you treat them differently and you pick some out and you say, I'll treat these well because they treat me well, because they're part of my group or whatever, then you're just like everybody else. And your righteousness is no more than anybody else in the world. Everybody in the world treats people well who treat them well. And so God has always expected better behavior than that. So he has gone through and he has laid out the deficiencies of the Pharisees and their view of the law. Next time, we're going to get into chapter 6, where he begins to really attack their hypocrisy at an even deeper level. And he starts talking about the show that the Pharisees put on. We're going to go on through most of the rest of the, maybe all of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount in our next lesson. And so we invite you to join us for that. Appreciate you joining us today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to respond on our YouTube page, or you can write us through our webpage by email, and we'd love to talk more about these things. Again, thank you for joining us, and we'll hope to see you again next time.